The cameras were rolling on the Viva Las Vegas set in 1963, and everyone could see it. The chemistry between Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret was so explosive that it couldn't be contained within the frame. While Priscilla Beaulieu waited patiently at Graceland for the man who promised to marry her, Elvis was falling for someone the press would call his female counterpart, a woman whose electric energy matched his own. The tabloids smelled blood in the water, and they weren't wrong. What started as professional admiration during dance rehearsals quickly became something Hollywood couldn't stop talking about. By the time the film wrapped, one of music history's most controversial love triangles had been set in motion, and Priscilla, thousands of miles away, was reading about it in the newspapers just like everyone else. Before we dive deeper into this forbidden romance, please subscribe to keep discovering the untold stories behind music's greatest legends. The first time Elvis Presley laid eyes on Ann-Margret Olsson on July 9, 1963. Something shifted in the carefully controlled universe he had built around himself. The MGM soundstage in Culver City was buzzing with the usual pre-production energy, technicians checking lights, costume designers making last-minute adjustments, and the director George Sidney reviewing shot lists. Elvis had arrived in his typical fashion, surrounded by the Memphis Mafia, his protective circle of friends and bodyguards, who had accompanied him through every film since his return from Germany. He had made 24 films by this point in his career, and the routine had become mechanical, predictable, safe. He would show up, hit his marks, sing his songs, kiss his co-star with professional detachment, and return to his trailer where the real Elvis could hide behind the persona everyone expected. But when Ann-Margret walked onto that soundstage, wearing a simple rehearsal outfit that somehow looked like it was designed specifically for her body, Elvis felt something he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps not since those early days at Sun Records when music still felt dangerous and unpredictable. She moved with a confidence that matched his own, a sexual energy that didn't apologize for itself, and when she smiled at him during their first introduction, it wasn't the starstruck smile of a young actress meeting the king. It was the smile of an equal, someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry the weight of public desire on your shoulders every single day. The chemistry was immediate, undeniable, and dangerous. What most people didn't understand about Elvis in 1963 was how profoundly isolated he had become within his own fame. Since returning from military service in Germany in 1960, he had been locked into a contract with Colonel Tom Parker that demanded 2, sometimes 3 films per year, each one more formulaic than the last. The music that had made him a revolutionary force in American culture had been reduced to soundtrack filler, disposable pop songs written by Tin Pan Alley hacks who had never felt the raw power of rockabilly or the soul-deep ache of the blues. His co-stars were usually pleasant but forgettable, young actresses who treated him with a mixture of awe and fear, never quite seeing him as a human being with doubts and desires that extended beyond the script. Priscilla, waiting for him back at Graceland, represented a different kind of relationship entirely, one built on his terms, shaped by his vision of what a woman should be. He had met her in Germany when she was only 14 years old, and over the years he had molded her into his ideal companion, controlling everything from her hair color to her wardrobe to her daily schedule. She loved him, certainly, but it was a love built on devotion and obedience, not on equality or mutual recognition. Ann-Margret, by contrast, didn't need Elvis to complete her. She was already a star in her own right, having captured Hollywood's attention with her breakout role in Bye Bye Birdie earlier that year, and she carried herself with the assurance of someone who knew exactly what she was worth. And Elvis, for perhaps the first time since his mother Gladys died, felt seen by someone who didn't want anything from him except his authentic self. The rehearsals for Viva Las Vegas began in earnest on July 15, 1963, and from the very first dance number it was clear to everyone on set that something extraordinary was happening. The film's choreographer David Winters had designed a series of high-energy routines that required Elvis and Ann-Margret to move in perfect synchronization, their bodies responding to each other's rhythms with split-second precision. During the rehearsal of Come On Everybody, a rock and roll number set in a casino, Elvis and Ann-Margret improvised movements that weren't in the original choreography, feeding off each other's energy in a way that made the professional dancers on set stop and watch. She would spin, and he would catch her without missing a beat. He would lean back into a signature Elvis move, and she would mirror it with her own twist, adding a feminine sensuality that complemented rather than competed with his masculine swagger. George Sidney, watching from his director's chair, knew immediately that he had captured something rare on film, but he also recognized that what he was witnessing extended far beyond professional chemistry. Between takes, Elvis and Ann-Margret would stay on the soundstage, talking quietly in corners, laughing at private jokes that no one else understood, and there was a tenderness in the way Elvis looked at her that his entourage had never seen before. Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's closest friends and a member of the Memphis Mafia, would later recall that Elvis seemed lighter during those weeks, less burdened by the weight of expectation, as if Ann-Margret's presence had given him permission to remember who he had been before the fame consumed everything. But back in Memphis, Priscilla was beginning to sense that something had changed. The first articles began appearing in the entertainment press in late July, just innocent enough to maintain plausible deniability, but suggestive enough to plant seeds of doubt. Elvis and Ann-Margret set Viva Las Vegas on fire, read one headline. Chemistry so hot it melts the film, declared another. The photographs accompanying these articles told their own story. Elvis and Ann-Margret dancing together between takes, their hands intertwined in ways that seemed more intimate than professional. Elvis with his arm around Ann-Margret's waist during a lunch break, her head tilted toward his shoulder. Ann-Margret laughing at something Elvis whispered in her ear, her expression unguarded in a way that suggested private understanding rather than public performance. Priscilla, sitting in the living room at Graceland with these magazines spread across her lap, felt a cold dread settling into her chest. She had dedicated 5 years of her life to Elvis, had shaped herself according to his specifications, had tolerated his absences and his moods, and his need to be surrounded by his entourage at all times. She had believed, or perhaps forced herself to believe, that his faithfulness was assured by the uniqueness of their bond, by the fact that he had chosen her when she was still young enough to be molded into his perfect companion. Now, looking at these photographs of Elvis with a woman who clearly didn't need to be molded into anything, Priscilla understood that her position was far more precarious than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. The phone calls between Memphis and Hollywood began, each one more strained than the last. Elvis, when confronted about the rumors, did what he always did when emotional demands were placed on him. He deflected, rationalized, and ultimately refused to give Priscilla the reassurance she desperately needed. "It's just publicity for the film," he told her during one particularly heated phone conversation in early August. "You know how Hollywood works. They create these stories to sell tickets." But Priscilla had been around Elvis long enough to recognize when he was lying, or more accurately, when he was telling a truth that omitted the most important parts. The publicity might have been manufactured, but the feelings behind it were genuine, and Elvis's refusal to explicitly deny the affair told Priscilla everything she needed to know. In her 1985 memoir, Elvis and Me, Priscilla would describe the rage that consumed her during those weeks, a rage that culminated in a famous incident where she threw a vase across Graceland's living room, shattering it against the wall while demanding that Elvis come home immediately. But Elvis didn't come home, not right away. The filming of Viva Las Vegas was scheduled to continue through September, and Colonel Parker, who viewed Elvis's romantic entanglements as potential threats to his carefully managed image, was monitoring the situation closely but hadn't yet intervened. Elvis was caught between three forces: his genuine connection with Ann-Margret, his obligation to Priscilla, and the Colonel's increasingly insistent reminders that scandal could destroy everything they had built together. And then something happened that would define the rest of Elvis's relationship with both women. In late August, during a rare weekend break from filming, Elvis invited Ann-Margret to join him and some members of the Memphis Mafia for a private gathering at a rented house in Palm Springs. This wasn't unusual in itself. Elvis often hosted informal parties where friends and associates could relax away from the public eye, but the invitation to Ann-Margret signaled a level of intimacy that crossed the boundary between professional colleagues and something far more serious. According to multiple accounts from people who were present that weekend, Elvis and Ann-Margret spent most of their time together, sitting by the pool talking about their childhoods, Their fears about the film industry's tendency to reduce complex artists to marketable commodities, and their shared understanding of what it meant to perform a version of yourself so often that the authentic self became increasingly difficult to access. Red West, another member of the Memphis Mafia, later said that he had never seen Elvis so relaxed with a woman who wasn't his mother. There was no need for Elvis to perform his usual role as the dominant figure who controlled every aspect of his relationships. Ann-Margret challenged him intellectually, matched his energy physically, and most importantly, didn't seem to need him to be the king. She was content with him being just Elvis, whatever that meant beneath all the layers of fame and expectation. But this equality, which should have been liberating, ultimately became the relationship's fatal flaw. Because Elvis Presley had built his entire emotional architecture on the foundation of control, and Ann-Margret refused to be controlled. The filming of Viva Las Vegas concluded on September 13, 1963, and everyone involved knew they had created something special. George Sidney had captured a chemistry on screen that couldn't be faked or manufactured through clever editing, and the musical numbers, particularly The Lady Loves Me and Come On Everybody, showcased Elvis and Ann-Margret at their absolute peak, two performers so perfectly synchronized that they seemed to be operating as a single organism. The wrap party was bittersweet, filled with the usual Hollywood promises to stay in touch and work together again. But beneath the surface pleasantries, there was an unspoken understanding that something significant was ending. Elvis returned to Memphis, to Graceland, to Priscilla, and to the carefully structured life that Colonel Parker had designed for him. Ann-Margret continued her own career trajectory, starring in a series of successful films throughout the mid-1960s and establishing herself as one of Hollywood's most bankable leading ladies. But the connection between them didn't simply evaporate when the cameras stopped rolling. Instead, it transformed into something more complex and enduring than a simple on-set romance, something that would continue to resonate through both of their lives for decades to come. What happened next would become one of Hollywood's most carefully guarded secrets and most persistent legends. In the months following the completion of Viva Las Vegas, Elvis and Ann-Margret maintained contact through phone calls and letters, a fact that Priscilla would discover in early 1964, and that would lead to some of the most explosive confrontations of their relationship. The details of these communications remain largely private. Neither Elvis nor Ann-Margret ever publicly disclosed the content of their conversations, but those close to Elvis reported that he seemed torn between two incompatible desires. On one hand, there was the life he had already built, centered around Graceland and Priscilla, and the familiar routines that provided stability in an otherwise chaotic existence. On the other hand, there was the possibility of something different. A partnership with someone who understood the unique pressures of fame because she lived them herself. But Elvis, for all his revolutionary impact on popular culture, was fundamentally conservative in his personal relationships. He had been raised in the American South with traditional values about marriage and family, and those values, combined with Colonel Parker's relentless emphasis on maintaining a clean public image, made it nearly impossible for him to seriously consider leaving Priscilla for Ann-Margret, no matter how intense his feelings might have been. And Ann-Margret, sensing this fundamental inability to choose, made the decision for him. In mid-1964, Ann-Margret began dating Roger Smith, a former actor who had transitioned into talent management, and by 1967 they would be married. Elvis, hearing the news through Hollywood's gossip network, reportedly experienced a period of depression that worried even his closest friends. He had wanted Ann-Margret in his life but on his terms, available when he needed her but understanding when he couldn't fully commit. Her decision to move on, to build a life with someone who could offer her the partnership and equality she deserved, forced Elvis to confront the consequences of his own emotional unavailability. And yet, remarkably, this wasn't the end of their story. Unlike so many of Elvis's romantic relationships, which tended to end in bitterness and recrimination, his connection with Ann-Margret evolved into something that transcended conventional categories. They remained friends, or perhaps something deeper than friends, something for which the English language doesn't have an adequate term. They spoke occasionally by phone, always with warmth and genuine affection, and Elvis established a tradition that would continue until the day he died, sending Ann-Margret flowers on opening night of every stage show she performed, elaborate arrangements delivered with a simple card signed "The King." These flowers would become the physical manifestation of everything they had been to each other and everything they could never become. When Viva Las Vegas was released on May 20, 1964, it became one of Elvis's highest-grossing films, earning over $4.5 million during its initial theatrical run, a massive success by the standards of the era. Critics, who had largely dismissed Elvis's film career as artistically bankrupt, found themselves forced to acknowledge that something genuine had been captured on screen. Variety called the chemistry between Elvis and Ann-Margret thermonuclear, while The Hollywood Reporter noted that Presley finally has a leading lady who can match him step for step, both literally and figuratively. But for those who understood the backstory, watching Viva Las Vegas was a bittersweet experience, because every glance, every touch, every moment of synchronized movement carried the weight of what might have been. Elvis would make 27 films after Viva Las Vegas, but he would never again display the kind of unguarded joy and genuine connection that he shared with Ann-Margret on screen. His subsequent co-stars, no matter how talented or beautiful, were performing opposite the king, while Ann-Margret had been performing opposite Elvis, and that difference, subtle but profound, was visible in every frame of every film that followed. Priscilla, for her part, won the immediate battle but understood that she had not won the war for Elvis's heart. In May 1967, she and Elvis were finally married in a quick ceremony in Las Vegas, fulfilling the promise he had made to her years earlier in Germany. But the marriage was troubled from the start, haunted by Elvis's infidelities, his increasing dependence on prescription medications, and the fundamental incompatibility between Priscilla's growing desire for independence and Elvis's need to maintain absolute control over his domestic life. They would divorce in 1973, and Priscilla would later acknowledge in interviews that she always knew there was a part of Elvis's emotional life that remained inaccessible to her, a private chamber that he had sealed off after his mother's death and had opened only briefly for Ann-Margret before slamming it shut again out of fear or obligation, or some combination of both. Meanwhile, the legend of the Elvis and Ann-Margret affair continued to grow, fed by rumors, speculation, and the occasional tantalizing detail that would emerge in interviews or memoirs. The most significant revelation came in 1994, 17 years after Elvis's death, when Ann-Margret published her autobiography, Ann-Margret, My Story. In it, she addressed the relationship directly, though with a careful discretion that left many questions unanswered. She described Elvis as her soulmate, a term that sent shockwaves through the fan community because of its implications. Not boyfriend, not lover, not affair, soulmate. The word suggested a connection that transcended physical intimacy, something deeper and more enduring than a simple on-set romance. She wrote about their shared understanding of what it meant to be public property, to have your image manipulated and your private life dissected by strangers who felt entitled to every detail. She described phone conversations that continued throughout both of their lives, talks that would last for hours as they discussed their careers, their relationships, their fears, and their dreams. And she revealed the detail about the flowers that Elvis sent to every opening night, a tradition that continued even after his death because he had prearranged and prepaid for the deliveries to continue, ensuring that even from beyond the grave he would be present for her important moments. This revelation transformed the narrative from scandal to something approaching tragedy, a love story constrained by circumstance rather than lack of feeling. For those in Elvis's inner circle, Ann-Margret always occupied a unique position. Unlike Priscilla, who many of the Memphis Mafia viewed as an interloper trying to separate Elvis from his friends, Ann-Margret was respected and even admired. Joe Esposito would later say that she was the only woman he ever saw Elvis treat as a true equal, someone whose opinions he valued and whose independence he respected even when it frustrated him. Red West, in his controversial 1977 book Elvis, What Happened, mentioned Ann-Margret only briefly but significantly, noting that during the period when Elvis was seeing her, he seemed more grounded, less dependent on the prescription medications that were already beginning to dominate his life. There was even speculation among some of Elvis's closest friends that if he had made different choices in 1964, if he had been willing to risk Colonel Parker's disapproval and society's judgment, his life might have taken a fundamentally different trajectory. With Ann-Margret, they theorized, Elvis might have found the kind of partnership that could have challenged him creatively, supported him emotionally, and perhaps even helped him navigate the descent into prescription drug dependency that would ultimately kill him at age 42. But such speculation, however tempting, ignores the fundamental reality of who Elvis Presley was by 1963. The truth is that Elvis had been shaped by forces far more powerful than romantic love: his mother's death in 1958, Colonel Parker's suffocating control over every aspect of his career, the burden of being the king in a culture that demanded he maintain that title at all costs. Ann-Margret represented possibility, but possibilities require courage to pursue, and Elvis, for all his revolutionary impact on music and culture, was deeply conservative in his personal life. He was a man who bought a mansion for his parents and continued to sleep in the room next to his father's even as an adult. He was someone who gave Cadillacs to near strangers but couldn't bring himself to fire Colonel Parker even when he realized the extent of the financial exploitation. He was the king who needed a court of loyal subjects to affirm his position every single day. Ann-Margret, magnificent and independent and secure in her own identity, could never have fit into that structure without compromising essential parts of herself. And unlike Priscilla, who at least attempted to shape herself according to Elvis's specifications, Ann-Margret had already been fully formed by the time they met. So they remained locked in a relationship that existed outside of conventional definitions. Not quite an affair, not quite just friends, something in the permanent subjunctive mood. The flowers continued to arrive at Ann-Margret's dressing room before every opening night, massive arrangements that became something of a legendary ritual in show business circles. Other performers would see them being delivered and know that the king was paying tribute to the one woman he couldn't have but never stopped caring for. After Elvis's death on August 16, 1977, Ann-Margret attended the funeral at Graceland, one of the few Hollywood figures Elvis's father, Vernon, specifically requested be present. Photographs from that day show her weeping openly, her grief unguarded in a way that suggested this was not the mourning of a former co-star, but something far more profound. In the years that followed, she rarely spoke publicly about Elvis except in the most general terms, protecting the privacy of what they had shared even as the legend around their relationship continued to grow. But those who were close to both of them understood that Elvis and Ann-Margret had experienced something rare in Hollywood, a genuine recognition of kindred spirits, two people who understood each other completely and loved each other deeply but could never quite find a way to make that love fit into the lives they were already living. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of the story. Not that the relationship ended, but that it never quite began. Today, more than 6 decades after Elvis and Ann-Margret first met on the Viva Las Vegas set, their story continues to fascinate, because it represents something we all understand at a fundamental level: the paths not taken, the possibilities foreclosed by circumstance or fear or obligation. We look at the footage from Viva Las Vegas and see two people operating at the absolute peak of their powers, so perfectly synchronized that it seems impossible they were ever apart. We read Ann-Margret's careful words about soulmates and pre-arranged flowers, and we understand that some connections transcend the categories we use to organize human relationships. We think about Elvis in his final years, bloated by medication and trapped in a cycle of Vegas performances that had long since lost any artistic meaning, and we wonder what might have happened if he had made different choices in 1964. Would Ann-Margret have been the partner who could have challenged Colonel Parker's control, who could have insisted on better material, who could have helped Elvis rediscover the revolutionary spirit that had made him the king in the first place? We'll never know, because life doesn't offer do-overs, and Elvis ran out of time on that August day in 1977. But the flowers kept coming to Ann-Margret's dressing room, delivered according to instructions Elvis had left before his death. A testament to a love that couldn't exist in the conventional world but refused to disappear completely. And when Ann-Margret, now in her 80s, speaks about Elvis in interviews, her voice still carries a tenderness that transcends nostalgia, a recognition that she knew him in ways that most people never could, and that he knew her in return. Their relationship exists in that strange territory between fact and legend, documented by photographs and interviews but ultimately understood only by the two people who lived it. What we're left with is the film, forever preserved on celluloid. Elvis and Ann-Margret moving together with impossible grace, looking at each other with undisguised affection, giving us a glimpse of what they might have been to each other in a different world, under different circumstances, free from the weight of expectation and the demands of fame. And maybe that's enough, that glimpse of possibility, that moment of perfect synchronization before reality reasserted its claims. The story of Elvis and Ann-Margret reminds us that love is not always measured in years together, or legal commitments or public declarations. Sometimes it exists in the space between what is said and what is left unsaid, in flowers delivered to opening nights, in phone calls that last for hours, in the use of a single word, soulmate, chosen with careful precision decades after the fact. It exists in the way two people could make a movie together and capture something so genuine that it still moves audiences 60 years later, long after both of their careers had taken entirely different trajectories. And it exists in the loyalty of remembering, in Ann-Margret's continued protection of Elvis's memory, in her refusal to exploit or sensationalize what they shared, even as others repeatedly asked her to do so. The forbidden passion on the Viva Las Vegas set was real, but it was also more complicated than passion, deeper than scandal, and ultimately more enduring than a simple affair could ever be. Because some connections once made can never be completely severed, no matter how many years pass or how many miles separate or how many other relationships attempt to fill the void. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this one, maybe Elvis and Ann-Margret finally have the freedom to be what they always were to each other, equals, partners, soulmates, who met at exactly the wrong time but recognized each other completely. The cameras have stopped rolling, the audience has gone home, and they can finally stop performing the versions of themselves that the world demanded, and just be two people who understood what it meant to carry the weight of fame and desire and expectation every single day. That's the real ending to their story, not the one captured in tabloid headlines or even in carefully worded memoirs, but the one that exists in possibility, in the permanent what-if that defines every great love story that circumstance prevented from becoming ordinary. They had their moment on the Viva Las Vegas set in 1963, and that moment echoed through the rest of their lives, quieter than scandal but deeper than most people will ever experience. And maybe, in the end, that was enough.